Have you ever wondered what it would be like to fall in love with someone you were supposed to hate? To find your heart drawn to the very person your country had taught you to fear? In the darkest chapter of human history, when nations turned against each other and brother fought brother, the most unlikely love stories began to unfold. This is the story of forbidden romance during World War II. A tale of letters that crossed enemy lines, carrying secrets that could have meant death for both sender and receiver. These are the words that defied war itself, written by trembling hands in candlelight, hidden beneath floorboards, and smuggled through bombed cities. Tonight, we journey back to a time when love was the ultimate act of rebellion, when choosing your heart over your homeland could cost you everything. These letters survived against impossible odds, and now they tell us something extraordinary about the human spirit, something that governments and armies could never destroy, no matter how hard they tried. The year was 1943. Europe lay shattered beneath the weight of total war. Cities burned, families fled, and millions of young men and women found themselves thrust into a conflict they never wanted. But somewhere between the air raid sirens and the rationed meals, between the propaganda posters and the blackout curtains, something beautiful began to grow. Picture this scene. A small village in occupied France where German soldiers patrolled cobblestone streets that had known peace for centuries. The local bakery still opened each morning. Though flour was scarce, children still played in the square, though their games had changed. And in a modest house at the end of the lane, a young woman named Marie worked as a translator for the occupying forces. Marie spoke 4 languages fluently. Before the war, she had dreamed of becoming a teacher, perhaps traveling to distant countries to share knowledge and culture. Instead, she found herself translating military documents. Her skills turned toward a purpose she despised. Each morning, she walked to the commandeered town hall, her footsteps echoing against buildings that bore the scars of occupation. It was there she first encountered Lieutenant Klaus Vber. He was not what she expected from the enemy. Where she had imagined brutality, she found quiet intelligence. Where she anticipated arrogance, she discovered someone who seemed as weary of war as she felt. He spoke to her with respect, always addressing her as mademoiselle, never raising his voice or making demands. Klaus had been drafted from his studies at university, where he was pursuing literature and philosophy. He carried a worn copy of poetry in his jacket pocket, verses that spoke of beauty and love rather than conquest and glory. He had seen enough of war to know that victory meant nothing if it destroyed everything worth protecting. Their first conversation lasted only minutes. Marie translated a document about supply routes while Klaus reviewed maps spread across the heavy wooden table. But something passed between them in those moments. A recognition, perhaps. An understanding that neither of them belonged in this world of uniforms and fear. Days turned to weeks, and their professional interactions grew longer. Klaus began asking her opinion on translations, seeking nuance rather than mere accuracy. Marie found herself explaining cultural context, helping him understand not just words, but meaning. They discovered they had both read the same books, both wondered about the same questions that had no easy answers. The first letter was never meant to be a letter at all. Klaus had written down a poem, something he remembered from his university days, and left it on the desk where Marie worked. When she arrived, the next morning, she found the folded paper beside her typewriter. The poem spoke of spring, returning after the longest winter, of hope surviving in the smallest places. Marie kept that paper for 3 days before she responded. She wrote her own poem in return, something about 2 birds from different flocks finding themselves in the same storm. She placed it carefully where Klaus would find it, her heart racing with the dangerous implications of such a simple gesture. This became their secret language. Poetry and literature became their bridge across an impossible divide. They wrote about books they loved, about dreams they had harbored before the world went mad. They shared thoughts about philosophy and art, about what made life beautiful and worth living. Never once did they mention the war directly, yet it haunted every word they exchanged. Klaus wrote about his hometown in Bavaria, where his family tended a small vineyard, He described autumn mornings when mist clung to the valleys, and how his grandmother made apple strudel that filled the entire house with warmth. He wrote about his younger sister who played piano, and how music had the power to heal wounds that medicine could never touch. Marie responded with stories of her childhood in Normandy, where her father had been a clockmaker. She wrote about the satisfaction of watching him repair intricate mechanisms, bringing time itself back to life with patient hands. She described summer evenings when the whole village would gather in the square for festivals, when differences seemed small and joy felt infinite. Their letters grew bolder as trust developed between them. Klaus confessed his doubts about the cause he was forced to serve. He wrote about fellow soldiers who questioned orders, about moments of humanity he had witnessed even in the darkest circumstances. He shared his fears about what the war was doing to his soul, how he struggled to remain the person his family had raised him to be. Marie revealed her own inner turmoil. She wrote about the guilt she felt working for the occupying forces, even though she had little choice. She described the pain of watching her neighbors suffer, of translating documents that affected the lives of people she had known since childhood. She admitted her terror that someone would discover their correspondence and the consequences that would follow. As autumn arrived, their letters became lifelines. Klaus was transferred to different locations throughout the region, but somehow their messages found their way to each other. They developed an elaborate system involving trusted intermediaries, coded locations, and carefully timed exchanges. The risk grew greater with each passing week, but neither could bear to stop. Klaus wrote from a military hospital where he had been sent to recover from a minor injury. He described wounded soldiers from both sides lying in the same ward, their suffering erasing the artificial boundaries that politics had created. He wrote about a young French resistance fighter who had been captured, how the boy reminded him of his own brother back home. Marie responded from her increasingly dangerous position in the village. Suspicions were growing about her activities. Fellow villagers questioned her daily interactions with German officers, while the Germans themselves had begun watching her more carefully. She wrote about sleepless nights, about jumping at every unexpected sound, about the constant fear that discovery was imminent. Yet through all this danger, something extraordinary continued to grow between them. Their letters revealed not just attraction, but deep understanding. They found in each other someone who shared their values, their hopes, their determination to preserve humanity in the face of inhumanity. They wrote about love not as conquest or possession, but as recognition of another soul fighting the same battles against despair. Klaus described love as finding someone who saw the world through your eyes, who understood that true strength lay in gentleness, that real courage meant protecting what was vulnerable rather than destroying what was different. He wrote about wanting to build something beautiful together when the madness finally ended. Marie wrote about love as a flame that could not be extinguished by circumstances, a light that grew brighter when surrounded by darkness. She described imagining a future where their letters would no longer need to be hidden, where they could speak freely about the connection that had sustained them through impossible times. Their correspondence continued through that terrible autumn and into winter. Each letter carried greater risk, yet each also carried greater hope. They were writing not just to each other, but to the possibility that love could survive anything, that human connection could transcend the artificial barriers that war had created. What they could not know was that their letters were being watched, that their careful system of exchange had been compromised, that forces beyond their control were already moving to destroy what they had built together. The storm they had written about was approaching, and soon they would discover just how much they were willing to sacrifice for love. But that is a story for tomorrow, when we continue reading these remarkable letters and discover what happened when two hearts chose love over loyalty, when the price of forbidden romance finally came due. The winter of 1943 brought more than snow to occupied France. It brought betrayal wrapped in the guise of duty, surveillance disguised as routine inspection, Someone had been watching Marie and Klaus far longer than either of them realized. Someone who understood that even the smallest acts of human connection posed a threat to the machinery of war. Marie first sensed the danger during her morning walk to the town hall. The usual greeting from Madame Dubois at the corner bakery never came. Instead, the elderly woman turned away, busying herself with day-old bread that needed no rearranging. Other neighbors who had always nodded politely now found urgent reasons to cross the street when they saw her approaching. She arrived at her desk that December morning to find it thoroughly searched. Papers had been moved, drawers opened, and imperfectly closed. Her typewriter sat at a slightly different angle than she always left it. Most telling of all, the small pencil she habitually placed parallel to the paper's edge now lay perpendicular. Someone had been through everything she owned. Klaus noticed the change immediately when he entered the office. Marie's usual quiet confidence had been replaced by nervous glances toward the door. Her hands trembled slightly as she worked, and she avoided meeting his eyes completely. When he tried to speak with her about a translation, she responded in monosyllables, her voice barely above a whisper. That afternoon brought the first direct confrontation. Captain Heinrich Müller, Klaus's commanding officer, summoned him to a private meeting in the room that had once served as the mayor's office. Müller was a career soldier, a man who had risen through the ranks by following orders without question and ensuring others did the same. The captain's words cut through the winter air like shards of ice. Reports had reached him about inappropriate fraternization between German personnel and local civilians. Such behavior undermined military discipline and endangered operational security. Any soldier found engaging in unauthorized contact with the local population would face immediate court-martial and transfer to the Eastern Front. Klaus maintained perfect composure during this warning, his face revealing nothing of the turmoil beneath. He acknowledged the captain's concerns with appropriate military courtesy, assured him of his complete understanding of regulations, and requested permission to return to his duties. But his mind raced with implications he dared not voice. The Eastern Front meant almost certain death. Hitler's war against the Soviet Union had become a grinding nightmare that consumed entire divisions. Soldiers sent there rarely returned, and those who did carried haunted eyes and stories they could never fully tell. The threat was clear and absolute. Marie faced her own interrogation that same evening. Two men in dark coats appeared at her door just as the sun disappeared behind the village church. They identified themselves as security officials conducting routine interviews with all civilian employees of the military administration. Their questions seemed innocent enough at first. How long had she worked as a translator? Did she enjoy her position? Had she noticed anything unusual among the German personnel? Were there any soldiers who seemed particularly friendly with local civilians? The questions circled closer and closer to their true purpose, like predators approaching wounded prey. Marie answered carefully, truthfully where possible, evasively when necessary. Yes, she had observed that some soldiers seemed homesick. No, she had not noticed any inappropriate behavior. Yes, she understood the importance of maintaining professional boundaries. No, she had never engaged in personal conversations with military personnel. The officials seemed satisfied with her responses, but their final words carried an unmistakable warning. The security of the occupation depended on everyone fulfilling their proper role. Any deviation from established protocols would be investigated thoroughly. Such investigations, they noted with cold smiles, often revealed activities that required immediate correction. After they left, Marie sat in her darkened kitchen for hours, afraid to light even a single candle. Every shadow seemed to hide watching eyes. Every sound suggested approaching footsteps. She understood now that their correspondence had been discovered, that their careful system of exchange had been compromised from the beginning. Klaus faced the same realization during his sleepless night in the officers' quarters. Their letters had been read, analyzed, reported up the chain of command. Every poem they had shared, every hope they had expressed, every moment of human connection they had celebrated had been catalogued as evidence of treasonous behavior. The next morning brought a new assignment for Klaus. He was to report immediately to headquarters in the regional capital for reassignment to duties better suited to his talents. The euphemism fooled no one. This was the beginning of his exile, the first step toward the Eastern Front and almost certain death. Marie arrived at her desk to find a replacement translator already in position, a middle-aged man with nervous eyes and trembling hands, someone desperate enough to accept any work that provided food and shelter. Her services were no longer required, effective immediately. Security officials would escort her home to collect her personal belongings. They met one final time in the town square as Klaus prepared to board the transport truck that would carry him away. Neither spoke, but their eyes held entire conversations. They had known this moment would come, had written about it in their letters, had prepared themselves as much as anyone could for the destruction of everything they had built together. Marie pressed a small folded paper into Klaus's hand as he climbed into the truck. He secreted it in his jacket pocket without reading it, knowing that even this final gesture carried enormous risk for both of them. The truck pulled away, with black exhaust trailing behind it like a funeral shroud. That night, alone in his temporary quarters, Klaus finally read Marie's last letter. She had written only a few lines, but they contained the essence of everything they had shared during their months of correspondence. She wrote about a garden that would grow again after the longest winter, about seeds that lay dormant beneath frozen ground, waiting for the warmth that would call them back to life, about flowers that would bloom more beautifully for having survived the harshest season, about love that could not be killed by separation, only strengthened by the knowledge that it had existed at all. Klaus folded the letter carefully and placed it next to his heart, where it would remain for the rest of the war. He began composing his own final message in his mind, words he would never be able to send but would carry with him wherever his military service might lead. He wrote about gratitude for having known love in the midst of hatred, for having discovered beauty in the darkest of times. He wrote about hope that transcended circumstances, about faith that their connection had changed them both in ways that no amount of distance could undo. He wrote about carrying her with him always, not as a burden, but as a blessing. Marie returned to her family home in Normandy, officially dismissed from her position for unspecified security concerns. Neighbors whispered about her involvement with German soldiers, creating an isolation that felt almost as complete as physical imprisonment. She spent her days helping her aging parents tend their small farm, her nights reading and rereading the letters Klaus had written to her. She began transcribing their entire correspondence into a leather journal her father had given her years earlier. Each poem, each shared memory, each expression of hope and fear found its place in pages that she vowed to preserve no matter what the future might bring. This became her sacred duty, her way of honoring what they had shared and ensuring it would not be forgotten. Klaus found himself assigned to a supply depot in occupied Poland. Technically a punishment detail, but one that kept him away from active combat. His commanding officers had decided that his skills were too valuable to waste on the Eastern Front, but too compromised to trust in sensitive positions. He spent his days managing inventory and his nights writing letters he could never send. Winter deepened across Europe, bringing with it news of battles won and lost, of cities liberated and conquered, of the tide of war slowly but inexorably turning against the German forces. Klaus began to hope that he might survive long enough to see the conflict end, to return to the world where love might be possible again. Marie received word through underground networks that resistance activities in her region were intensifying. Allied forces were preparing for some massive operation, though details remained closely guarded secrets. She volunteered to help however she could, translating intercepted German communications and providing intelligence about enemy movements. Both of them understood that the war's end would bring its own challenges. Klaus would face denazification proceedings, potential imprisonment, the complete rebuilding of his homeland and his life. Marie would need to navigate the complex emotions of liberation, the questions about her wartime activities, the uncertainty of what peace might actually look like. But they also understood something else, something that their letters had taught them about the indestructible nature of human connection. What they had shared transcended politics and nationality, survived separation and surveillance, proved stronger than the forces arrayed against it. Their love had become a form of resistance, a declaration that the human heart could not be conquered by armies or ideologies. As 1944 dawned across war-torn Europe, neither Marie nor Klaus knew if they would survive to see peace. Neither knew if they would ever meet again, ever have the chance to speak the words they had written to each other in secret. But both knew that they had experienced something extraordinary, something that justified every risk they had taken and every sacrifice they had made. The letters that had brought them together continued to sustain them apart, proof that love could flourish even in the darkest soil, that hope could survive the longest night, that the human spirit possessed resources that no amount of cruelty could exhaust. Their story was far from over, though they could not know what chapters still awaited them in the months ahead. The spring of 1944 brought whispers of hope across occupied Europe. Allied forces were gathering strength. Resistance networks grew bolder, and even the most hardened German officers began speaking quietly about defensive positions rather than glorious conquest. For Marie and Klaus, separated by hundreds of miles and the iron machinery of war, these distant rumors felt like messages from another world. Marie had found new purpose in her work with the French resistance. Her linguistic skills proved invaluable in decoding intercepted German transmissions. Her knowledge of military procedures helped identify vulnerable supply lines. She worked from a farmhouse hidden deep in the Norman countryside where coded radio messages crackled through the night air like electronic prayers. The resistance fighters who surrounded her were young men and women who had chosen danger over safety, action over submission. They called her by the code name Nightingale, partly for her ability to decode the enemy's songs of war, partly for the gentle strength she brought to their desperate mission. None of them knew about the letters hidden in her leather journal, about the German officer who had captured her heart. Klaus found himself transferred once again, this time to a communications center near the Belgian border. His superiors had finally recognized his talent for languages and analysis, though they remained suspicious of his loyalty. He spent his days intercepting Allied radio transmissions, searching for intelligence that might help the crumbling German war effort. The irony was not lost on him. He was now doing for the German army exactly what Marie was doing for the French resistance. They were working against each other, their skills turned toward opposing purposes, yet their hearts remained united by bonds that transcended nationality. Each decoded message felt like a betrayal of everything they had shared. The communications center buzzed with nervous energy as reports filtered in about massive Allied preparations along the English coast. Something enormous was coming, though German intelligence struggled to determine exactly where and when the blow would fall. Klaus found himself hoping that whatever was planned would succeed quickly, that the war might end before it consumed what remained of Europe's youth. His new commanding officer, Major Wilhelm Hoffmann, was a different breed from the harsh Captain Muller. Hoffmann had served in the First War, had seen enough death to understand its true cost. He treated his subordinates with weary respect, asking for competence rather than fanaticism, efficiency rather than enthusiasm for the cause. During one late evening shift, Hoffmann approached Klaus as he worked over a particularly complex transmission. The major studied the younger man's face in the lamplight, noting the careful concentration, the methodical approach to problems that had no easy solutions. "Your translations are excellent," Hoffmann said quietly. "You understand nuance better than most native speakers. Where did you learn such precision with languages?" Klaus explained about his university studies, his dreams of becoming a teacher or perhaps a diplomat in peacetime. He spoke carefully, revealing nothing about the French translator who had taught him that language could build bridges as well as walls. Hoffmann nodded thoughtfully. "I had similar dreams once," he said. "I wanted to be a historian, to study how civilizations rose and fell, how they learned from their mistakes. Then came the First War, and everything changed. Now here we are again, making the same errors our fathers made, expecting different results. The Major's words carried a weight of experience that Klaus was only beginning to understand. Hoffman had seen one war destroy a generation, watched a fragile peace collapse into an even more terrible conflict. He understood that victory and defeat were temporary conditions, that the real challenge lay in rebuilding what war had torn apart. Meanwhile, Marie's resistance work had brought her into contact with Allied intelligence officers preparing for the invasion everyone knew was coming. Her detailed knowledge of German communication procedures, her insights into enemy thinking patterns proved invaluable in planning operations that might save thousands of lives. She worked with a British colonel named James Morrison, a soft-spoken man who had spent years in occupied Europe coordinating resistance activities. Morrison recognized something unusual in Marie's approach to intelligence work, a precision that suggested formal training, an understanding of military culture that seemed almost intimate. During one of their planning sessions, Morrison asked about her background. How had she learned so much about German operational procedures? Where had she gained such insight into enemy psychology? Marie answered carefully, truthfully, where possible, creating a narrative that explained her knowledge without revealing its true source. She spoke about her work as a translator before joining the resistance, about observing German officers during routine administrative tasks. She described analyzing their communication patterns, studying their decision-making processes, learning to think like the enemy in order to defeat them. Every word was true, yet none revealed the deeper truth about Klaus and their correspondence. Morrison seemed satisfied with her explanations, but Marie sensed that he understood more than he revealed. Intelligence officers developed instincts about such things, learned to recognize when people carried secrets that went beyond professional necessity. He treated her with the same careful respect that Klaus had shown, asking for information without demanding confessions. As May arrived, the pace of preparation intensified dramatically. Marie found herself working 18-hour days, analyzing German defensive positions, identifying communication networks that could be disrupted during the coming assault. Every piece of intelligence might mean the difference between success and catastrophe for the men who would soon storm the beaches. Klaus experienced the same intensification from the opposite perspective. German forces worked frantically to strengthen coastal defenses, to anticipate where the Allied blow might fall. Communication traffic increased exponentially as commanders demanded constant updates, as defensive positions were reinforced and repositioned. During one particularly busy shift, Klaus intercepted a transmission that made his blood run cold. The message described increased resistance activity in the Norman countryside, specifically mentioning a cell operating from a farmhouse near the village where Marie's family lived. German security forces were planning a major sweep of the area, targeting anyone suspected of collaboration with enemy agents. Klaus stared at the decoded message for long minutes, his mind racing through impossible calculations. He could not warn Marie without exposing himself to charges of treason. He could not ignore the danger without abandoning the woman who had become the center of his emotional world. He could not act without destroying everything they had both worked to preserve. For the first time since their correspondence began, Klaus seriously considered desertion. He could slip away during a shift change, make his way toward the Norman coast, somehow find Marie, and warn her of the approaching danger. The fantasy lasted only minutes before reality reasserted itself. Desertion meant death, if captured, and capture was almost certain for a German soldier moving through increasingly hostile territory. Instead, Klaus made a different choice. He began subtly altering his translations of intercepted resistance communications, introducing small errors that might misdirect German security forces. He delayed processing certain messages, allowing resistance networks additional time to change locations. He walked the razor's edge between duty and betrayal, knowing that discovery meant immediate execution. Marie felt the increasing pressure as German security operations intensified throughout the region. Several resistance cells had been compromised, their members arrested or killed. Safe houses that had sheltered Allied agents for months suddenly became death traps. The network that had seemed so secure began showing dangerous cracks. During a nighttime radio transmission, she received coded orders to evacuate her current position immediately. German forces were moving through the countryside in systematic sweeps, checking every farmhouse, questioning every civilian. Her cover had not been blown, but the general crackdown made her position untenable. The evacuation meant abandoning the leather journal that contained her transcribed correspondence with Klaus. She had carried it with her throughout her resistance activities, adding new memories and insights whenever circumstances allowed. Now she faced the possibility of losing this tangible connection to the love that had sustained her through the darkest months of occupation. Marie made a desperate decision. She carefully removed several pages from the journal, the ones containing Klaus's most beautiful poems and her own responses. These she sewed into the lining of her coat, creating a hidden archive that could survive searches and interrogations. The rest of the journal she buried beneath the farmhouse floor, marking the location with a small stone cross. As she prepared to leave, Marie composed one final letter in her mind, words she would never be able to send but needed to express. She wrote about gratitude for having experienced love that transcended hatred, about hope that Klaus would survive whatever trials awaited him, about faith that their connection would endure regardless of what the war might bring. Klaus felt her presence slipping away like morning mist, though he had no rational reason for such intuition. Something in the patterns of intercepted communication suggested that resistance networks in her region were dissolving, their members scattered or captured. He found himself working with desperate intensity, hoping that his small acts of sabotage might create enough confusion to help her escape. The first days of June brought unprecedented activity to both their worlds. Allied preparations reached fever pitch as the invasion force assembled across the English Channel. German defensive efforts intensified correspondingly as commanders realized that the decisive moment was finally approaching. Marie found herself assigned to a new intelligence cell operating much closer to the coast. Her mission was to observe German defensive preparations and report on any changes that might affect invasion plans. She spent her days hidden in abandoned buildings, watching enemy soldiers strengthen fortifications that would soon be tested by Allied assault forces. Klaus received orders to relocate to a forward communications post near the very beaches where Allied forces planned to land. His unit would coordinate defensive communications during the expected invasion, ensuring that German commanders could respond quickly to enemy movements. He understood that he was being moved into the path of the coming storm. On the evening of June 4th, both Marie and Klaus found themselves staring at the same stretch of Norman coastline from opposite perspectives. She watched German soldiers working frantically to complete defensive positions, knowing that Allied liberation was only hours away. He observed the same preparations while hoping that his small acts of resistance might somehow protect the civilians caught in the approaching battle. Neither knew that the other was so close. Neither realized that the invasion they both awaited with such different emotions would bring them within miles of each other for the first time in over a year. Neither understood that the liberation of France would create new possibilities for connection, even as it threatened to destroy everything they had built through their correspondence. The storm that had been gathering since their first exchanged poems was about to break across the beaches of Normandy. What it would leave behind remained to be written in the sand and blood and hope of June 6th, 1944. To be written blue would leave behind Remain Normandy. What it in 6th and hope of'd and the sand, June 44, 90. The dawn of June 6th broke gray and uncertain over the English Channel. Marie crouched in the ruins of a coastal observation post, her eyes scanning the horizon through binoculars that trembled, despite her efforts at steadiness. The sea stretched endlessly before her, empty and deceptive in the early morning light. Yet somewhere beyond that horizon, she knew the largest invasion force in human history was preparing to write the next chapter of the war. Klaus stood at his communication station 3 miles inland, surrounded by radio equipment that crackled with nervous chatter from German defensive positions. His fingers moved mechanically across the transmission controls, but his mind wandered to thoughts of the French translator who had changed everything he understood about love and loyalty. He wondered if she was still alive, if she thought of him during these final hours before the world changed forever. The first reports arrived at Klaus's station just after dawn. Radar operators along the coast detected massive formations approaching from the north. Ships beyond counting, aircraft that darkened the sky like storm clouds, paratroopers falling like deadly rain behind German lines. The invasion had begun with a fury that exceeded even the most pessimistic German projections. Marie watched the horizon transform as Allied vessels materialized from the morning mist. Destroyers and cruisers, transport ships heavy with soldiers, landing craft that bobbed like corks on the churning water. The sight filled her with emotions too complex for simple joy. Liberation was coming, but at a cost that would be measured in thousands of lives. The naval bombardment began with a sound like thunder that never ended. German defensive positions disappeared in eruptions of sand and concrete and twisted metal. Klaus felt his communication bunker shake with each explosion, dust raining from the ceiling as the walls absorbed impacts that seemed to come from every direction at once. His radio filled with desperate calls from forward positions, units cut off by paratroopers, coastal batteries silenced by naval gunfire, defensive lines crumbling under assault from forces that seemed limitless. Klaus translated these reports mechanically, his training overriding the growing certainty that he was witnessing the collapse of everything his army had built. Marie moved closer to the coast as Allied forces established their foothold on Norman soil. She carried crucial intelligence about German reserve positions, information that could help the invasion forces break through the defensive lines that still held in some sectors. Every step brought her closer to freedom, but also closer to the chaos where Klaus struggled to maintain communications for a disintegrating defense. The afternoon brought news that transformed everything Klaus thought he understood about his situation. A coded transmission from Army headquarters ordered all communication personnel to destroy sensitive equipment and retreat to secondary positions. The coastal defenses were being abandoned. The invasion had succeeded beyond Allied hopes and German fears. Klaus found himself facing the same impossible choice that had haunted him since their correspondence began. He could follow orders and retreat with his unit, preserving the military discipline that had defined his entire adult life. Or he could remain in the combat zone, hoping against hope that he might somehow find Marie in the chaos of liberation and defeat. The decision came easier than he had expected. Klaus began systematically destroying the communication equipment that had been his responsibility, ensuring that German forces could no longer coordinate their retreat through his station. But instead of joining the withdrawal, he removed his uniform jacket and identification tags, transforming himself from a German soldier into a civilian refugee. Marie reached the outskirts of the coastal village just as German forces began their retreat. Allied soldiers moved through the streets with careful efficiency, checking buildings for enemy stragglers, providing medical aid to wounded civilians, beginning the complex process of establishing military government in liberated territory. She approached the nearest Allied officer, a young American lieutenant who looked barely old enough to shave. In perfect English, she identified herself as a resistance operative with intelligence about German defensive positions. The lieutenant's eyes widened with recognition of her value, and within minutes, she found herself escorted to a temporary command post established in the village school. Klaus moved through the same village from the opposite direction, his discarded uniform hidden beneath civilian clothes that he had found in an abandoned house. He carried no identification, no proof of his true identity, no way to explain his presence in a combat zone except as another displaced person seeking safety from the violence that consumed everything around them. The command post buzzed with activity as Allied officers processed intelligence reports and planned their next advances. Marie sat at a wooden desk that had been requisitioned from a classroom, translating captured German documents while American and British officers debated strategy around maps spread across children's desks. She worked with focused intensity, knowing that every piece of information might save Allied lives in the battles still to come. German defensive plans, supply routes, ammunition depots, communication protocols, all the details that could help the invasion forces maintain their momentum and prevent a counterattack that might drive them back into the sea. Outside the school, Klaus joined a group of civilians who had gathered near the village church seeking shelter from the continuing artillery exchanges. He listened to their conversations with growing amazement, hearing French voices speak openly about liberation for the first time in 4 years. The occupation was ending, but what would replace it remained uncertain. An elderly priest emerged from the church carrying water and bread for the displaced civilians. Klaus accepted both gratefully, his stomach reminding him that he had not eaten since the previous evening. The priest studied his face with eyes that had seen too much suffering to judge anyone harshly, offering comfort without questions about nationality or allegiance. Inside the command post, Marie finished translating the last of the captured documents and stretched her tired shoulders. The American lieutenant who had first encountered her approached with news that would change everything. Intelligence headquarters wanted to interview her personally about her resistance activities. A jeep would arrive within the hour to transport her to the divisional command post. Klaus heard the same vehicle approaching through the village square. Military jeeps had become the sound of occupation for 4 years, but now they carried the promise of liberation instead of the threat of oppression. He watched from the church steps as Allied soldiers moved with the confidence of men who knew they were winning, who understood that each day brought them closer to final victory. The jeep stopped directly in front of the school where Marie had been working. She gathered her few possessions and prepared to leave for what might be her final intelligence briefing of the war. As she emerged from the building, her eyes automatically scanned the civilians gathered around the church, a habit developed during months of resistance work. Klaus saw her at the same moment she noticed him. 4 years of war, months of separation, the chaos of invasion and liberation, all of it disappeared in the instant their eyes met across the village square. Neither moved for several heartbeats, both frozen by the impossibility of finding each other in the midst of such overwhelming destruction and rebirth. Marie made the first decision. Instead of boarding the waiting jeep, she walked slowly across the square toward the church where Klaus stood among the other displaced civilians. The American lieutenant called after her, confused by her sudden change in direction, but she continued walking as if pulled by forces stronger than military necessity. Klaus stepped away from the church as she approached, his heart racing with the knowledge that this moment would define the rest of their lives. They were no longer the translator and the officer who had exchanged secret letters in occupied France. They were simply two people who had found love in the darkest of times and somehow survived to stand together in the light of liberation. They met halfway across the square, neither speaking at first, both overwhelmed by the reality of physical presence after months of communication through written words alone. Marie reached out tentatively and touched Klaus's hand, confirming that he was real, that this was not another dream born of hope and desperation. The American lieutenant approached them with growing concern about his missing intelligence asset. Marie turned to him with a smile that contained more joy than he had seen since the WWII invasion began. She explained that she had found someone she had been searching for since the beginning of the war, someone whose survival meant more to her than any military briefing. Klaus understood enough English to follow the conversation, to realize that Marie was choosing him over her duty to the Allied forces that had liberated her country. The magnitude of her decision overwhelmed him, knowing that she was sacrificing her position with the resistance to remain with a former enemy soldier who had no legal status in the new order taking shape around them. The lieutenant studied Klaus with the practiced eye of someone trained to identify potential threats. He saw a young man whose clothes did not quite fit, whose presence in the village could not be easily explained, whose nationality remained suspiciously ambiguous. But he also saw the way Marie looked at him, with an expression that transcended politics and military necessity. After several minutes of careful questioning, the lieutenant made his own decision about love and war. Intelligence headquarters would have to conduct their debriefing without Marie. The chaos of liberation had created countless administrative complications, and one missing resistance operative would hardly be noticed among the thousands of displaced persons requiring documentation and assistance. Klaus and Marie found themselves officially classified as displaced civilians awaiting resettlement assistance. They were assigned temporary quarters in a farmhouse that had been abandoned during the German retreat, given basic supplies, and told to report for questioning when the military government had time to process their cases properly. That evening, they sat together in the farmhouse kitchen for the first time since their correspondence had begun. Candlelight flickered between them as they finally spoke aloud the words they had written to each other in secret for so many months. Their voices carried the same gentle strength that had sustained them through separation, the same hope that had defied every attempt to destroy it. Marie showed Klaus the pages she had saved from their correspondence, the poems and letters sewn into her coat lining. He read his own words with amazement, hardly believing that he had found the courage to write such things during the darkest period of his life. She had preserved not just their letters, but the evidence that love could survive anything. Klaus told her about his small acts of resistance, about the intelligence he had misdirected to protect resistance networks, about the choice he had made to abandon his military career for the chance to find her again. Marie understood that he had risked everything for the possibility that they might have a future together, that love might prove stronger than the forces that had tried to keep them apart. They talked through the night about the future they would build together, about the garden that would grow after the longest winter, about the flowers that would bloom more beautifully for having survived the harshest season. The war was ending, but their story was just beginning. Was just beginning. They spent the following weeks helping to rebuild the village that had sheltered their reunion. Klaus worked alongside French civilians to repair damaged buildings, his engineering knowledge from university proving valuable in restoring structures damaged by bombardment. Marie assisted the Allied military government in processing displaced persons, her linguistic skills helping to reunite families scattered by years of occupation. The summer of 1944 brought a strange new rhythm to their lives. They were together yet still living in uncertainty, free yet without official status, safe yet aware that their past could still threaten their future. Klaus remained technically a prisoner of war, though one who had never been formally captured or processed. Marie was officially a resistance hero, though one whose wartime activities raised questions she preferred not to answer completely. The Allied authorities struggled to categorize their relationship within the rigid framework of military justice. Klaus was German, therefore enemy, therefore subject to detention and eventual repatriation. Marie was French, therefore Allied, therefore deserving of protection and assistance. That they loved each other created a legal complexity that no regulation had anticipated. Major Morrison, the British intelligence officer who had worked with Marie during the resistance, arrived in the village during late July to conduct final debriefings with former operatives. He found her helping to organize a makeshift school in the church basement, teaching English to local children who had missed years of formal education during the occupation. Morrison observed the easy way Marie interacted with the displaced German civilians who had remained in the village after liberation. She translated for them during medical examinations, helped them navigate the bureaucratic requirements for temporary residency permits, treated them with the same compassion she showed to French refugees. Her behavior puzzled him until he understood the deeper truth it revealed. During their private conversation, Morrison asked direct questions about Klaus that Marie had been dreading for weeks. How had she met him? What was the nature of their relationship? Did she understand the potential complications her association with a former enemy soldier might create? Marie answered with careful honesty, revealing enough truth to satisfy official curiosity while protecting the deeper secrets that belonged only to them. She explained that Klaus had been assigned her office during the occupation, that they had developed a professional relationship based on mutual respect, that she had witnessed his gradual disillusionment with the war, and his eventual decision to abandon his military duties. Every statement was factual, yet none captured the transformative power of their correspondence. Morrison listened with the patience of someone who had spent years learning to read between the lines of human motivation. He understood that Marie was protecting something precious, something that transcended the simple categories of collaboration or resistance. Her careful answers told him more about her character than any detailed confession might have revealed. The Major made his decision based on pragmatic rather than romantic considerations. The Allied administration needed people with Marie's skills and local knowledge to help rebuild civil society in liberated France. Klaus possessed technical expertise that would be valuable in reconstruction efforts. Their personal relationship, while irregular, posed no security threat and might actually contribute to the reconciliation that would be necessary for lasting peace. Morrison's report classified Klaus as a voluntary defector who had provided valuable assistance to Allied forces during the liberation. This designation allowed him to remain in France under supervised release rather than facing repatriation to Germany. Marie was commended for her resistance activities and offered a position with the military government's Civilian Affairs Department. The bureaucratic solution created space for them to build a legitimate life together, but it could not address the emotional challenges they faced as former enemies learning to live in a world at peace. Klaus struggled with guilt over his military service, even though his conscience was clear about his final choices. Marie dealt with suspicious looks from neighbors who remembered seeing her work with German officers. They found solace in work that served others. Klaus joined reconstruction crews rebuilding damaged infrastructure throughout the region. His days were spent repairing bridges, restoring electrical systems, clearing rubble from streets that had known only destruction for too long. Each completed project felt like an act of atonement, a way of contributing to healing rather than causing harm. Marie established a translation service that helped displaced persons navigate the complex documentation required for resettlement. She worked with refugees from across Europe, people whose lives had been shattered by forces beyond their control, families seeking to rebuild connections that war had severed. Her office became a place where hope was translated into practical assistance. Their evening conversations often returned to the letters that had brought them together, but now they could speak freely about experiences they had only hinted at in their coded correspondence. Klaus described the anguish of translating orders that he knew would cause suffering, the moral compromises he had made before finding the courage to resist. Marie shared the terror of her resistance work, the constant fear that discovery would mean death for herself and everyone who had trusted her. They began writing again, not secret letters hidden from hostile authorities, but a joint memoir of their experience that might help others understand how love could survive in conditions designed to destroy it. Their story became a testament to the possibility of finding humanity even in the midst of systematic dehumanization. As autumn arrived, they received news that Klaus's family had survived the war. His parents' vineyard in Bavaria had been damaged, but not destroyed. His sister had continued her musical studies despite the chaos around her. The letter from his mother, forwarded through Red Cross channels, contained an invitation that neither Klaus nor Marie had dared to hope for. The invitation was for both of them. Klaus's mother had learned about Marie through letters from American occupation authorities processing Klaus's case. She understood that this French woman had saved her son's soul during the darkest period of his life, had given him reason to maintain his humanity when everything around him encouraged brutality. She wanted to meet the person who had preserved the boy she had raised. Marie's parents extended a similar welcome to Klaus when they finally returned to their farm in Normandy. Her father, the clockmaker, examined the young German with the careful attention he gave to intricate mechanisms that needed understanding rather than judgment. He saw someone who had been damaged by forces beyond his control but who retained the essential components necessary for proper function. The winter of 1944 brought the first Christmas that Klaus and Marie could celebrate together openly. They attended midnight mass in the village church where they had first seen each other after liberation, sitting among neighbors who had gradually accepted their unusual love story. The priest, who had offered Klaus shelter during those first chaotic days, blessed their relationship as evidence that God's grace could work even through the mechanisms of human hatred. They were married in that same church during the spring of 1945, just weeks before Germany's final surrender ended the war in Europe. Their wedding was attended by resistance fighters and former German soldiers, by French civilians and British officers, by everyone whose life had been touched by their determination to choose love over loyalty to artificial divisions. Major Morrison gave Marie away, having become something of a surrogate father during the months of bureaucratic uncertainty. Klaus's best man was a former Wehrmacht communications officer who had made similar choices about conscience and duty, who had found his own path toward redemption through service to former enemies. The ceremony was conducted in 3 languages, French and German and English, symbolizing their commitment to building bridges across the linguistic and cultural barriers that had been used to justify so much suffering. Their vows spoke not just of personal devotion, but of shared dedication to ensuring that the hatreds which had nearly destroyed them would never again be allowed to triumph over human connection. Their honeymoon was a working journey through the devastated regions of France and Germany, helping to establish communication networks that could reunite families separated by years of warfare. They used their combined linguistic skills to help former enemies begin the slow process of reconciliation, proving through their own example that love could indeed conquer the artificial boundaries that politics had created. Klaus and Marie settled finally in a small house near the Norman coast, close enough to both their families to maintain connection, but far enough from the sites of their wartime suffering to allow healing. Klaus established a small engineering firm that specialized in peaceful reconstruction projects. Marie opened a school that taught languages not as tools of military intelligence, but as bridges between different cultures and peoples. They never forgot the letters that had saved them both during the darkest period of human history. The correspondence that had begun as a desperate search for beauty in an ugly world had grown into something that transformed not just their own lives, but the lives of everyone who encountered their story. In the years that followed, they would receive visitors from across Europe and eventually across the world. Former soldiers seeking to understand how enemies could become lovers, young couples facing their own barriers to love, historians trying to comprehend how individual humanity had survived systematic attempts to destroy it. Each visitor left with a deeper understanding of love's power to resist even the most determined efforts at destruction. Their house became a pilgrimage site for those who needed proof that hope could survive anything, that human connection could transcend any barrier, that love remained the most powerful force in a world that often seemed determined to destroy everything beautiful. The letters they had written to each other during the war were eventually published, inspiring countless others to choose courage over fear, understanding over hatred, love over the artificial divisions that seemed so permanent and important. Klaus and Marie lived to see their grandchildren playing in gardens that had once known only the footsteps of soldiers speaking multiple languages with the easy fluency of those who had never known artificial barriers between peoples. They lived to see Europe united not by conquest, but by shared commitment to the values they had discovered in their correspondence. The recognition that human connection was more precious than any political ideology. Their story became legend, but the letters remained real, tangible proof that love could survive anything, that two hearts choosing each other could change the world in ways that armies and governments could never accomplish. The forbidden romance that had begun in secrecy and fear had grown into something that illuminated the path toward reconciliation and peace for generations, who would never know the particular darkness Klaus and Marie had survived. The letters from the front had carried more than words across enemy lines. They had carried the seeds of a future where love would be stronger than hatred, where understanding would triumph over fear, where the human heart would prove more durable than any weapon designed to destroy it. Durable than any weapon, where the human heart would triumph over feared to destroy it. Their legacy extended far beyond their own remarkable survival. In the decades following the war, Klaus and Marie became living symbols of reconciliation, their home a sanctuary where former enemies could meet on neutral ground. They hosted annual gatherings where veterans from all sides would share their stories, their pain, their gradual journey toward forgiveness. Klaus never spoke easily about his years in uniform, but when pressed by younger visitors seeking understanding, he would describe the slow erosion of everything he had been taught to believe. The propaganda that had seemed so convincing in university lecture halls crumbled when confronted with the reality of individual human suffering. Marie would add her own memories of watching neighbors disappear in the night, of the constant fear that shaped every decision during the occupation years. Together, they created workshops for couples facing cultural or religious barriers to their relationships. Their counsel was simple, but profound. Love required courage, they would say, but more importantly, it required the willingness to see beyond the categories that society used to divide people. They had learned to recognize the humanity in each other despite every external force, telling them they were natural enemies. The translation service Marie had established grew into a cultural center that brought together artists, writers, and musicians from across Europe. Klaus designed the buildings himself, creating spaces where different traditions could intersect without losing their unique character. The center hosted concerts where German composers were performed by French orchestras, exhibitions where artists from former enemy nations displayed their work side by side. Children from the local schools would visit regularly, listening wide-eyed to stories about a time when people from different countries were forbidden to speak to each other. Marie would show them the hidden compartments where letters had been concealed, explaining how dangerous it had been simply to express friendship across enemy lines. Klaus would demonstrate the radio equipment he had used, describing how the same technology used for warfare could also carry messages of hope. Their grandchildren grew up bilingual, switching effortlessly between French and German as they played in the garden where Klaus grew the same varieties of grapes his family had cultivated in Bavaria. Marie taught them the folk songs she had learned as a child in Normandy, while Klaus shared the poetry that had sustained him through the darkest months of the war. The house itself became a museum of sorts, though Klaus and Marie continued living there until their final years. Visitors could see the desk where Marie had worked on her translations, the radio room where Klaus had monitored communications, the garden where they had planted flowers mentioned in their wartime correspondence. Each room told part of their story, but the whole was greater than the sum of its parts. Universities began inviting them to speak about the psychology of enemy creation, about how ordinary people could be convinced to hate others they had never met. Their lectures drew standing-room-only crowds, students hungry to understand how love had survived systematic attempts to destroy it. They spoke without notes, their words carrying the authority of lived experience rather than academic theory. Klaus would describe the gradual process of dehumanization he had witnessed, how propaganda had slowly stripped away his ability to see enemies as individuals worthy of compassion. Marie would explain the parallel process of resistance, how maintaining her humanity had required constant vigilance against the hatred that occupation naturally bred. Together, they demonstrated that both processes could be reversed through conscious choice and sustained effort. The letters themselves were eventually donated to a research institute studying conflict resolution, but not before Klaus and Marie had created detailed annotations explaining the context behind each exchange. They wanted future researchers to understand not just what they had written, but why those particular words had been chosen, what risks each message had represented, how their relationship had evolved through written communication alone. Their annotations revealed layers of meaning that casual readers might miss. References to specific books carried coded information about meeting locations. Discussions of weather patterns indicated when it might be safe to attempt communication. Even their expressions of love had been carefully crafted to avoid arousing suspicion if intercepted by hostile authorities. As they aged, Klaus and Marie began experiencing the physical limitations that reminded them of their mortality, but their commitment to sharing their story only intensified. They established a foundation that provided scholarships for students studying conflict resolution, peace building, and cross-cultural communication. The selection criteria emphasized character over academic achievement, seeking young people who demonstrated the courage to build bridges rather than walls. The Foundation's work expanded to include support for refugees from contemporary conflicts, helping displaced families navigate the same bureaucratic challenges that Klaus and Marie had faced after liberation. Their staff included speakers of dozens of languages, people who understood that translation involved more than converting words from one tongue to another. Marie continued teaching until she was well into her 70s, though her classroom had expanded to include students from around the world who came specifically to learn from her experience. Her final course was titled simply The Language of Love, exploring how human connection could transcend any barrier that politics might create. Klaus would often visit these classes, adding his perspective to discussions about the courage required to choose conscience over conformity. Their final years were spent compiling a comprehensive archive of their experience, working with historians and psychologists to ensure that future generations would understand both the historical context and the emotional reality of their wartime correspondence. They insisted that their story be told honestly, including the mistakes they had made, the compromises they had accepted, the moments when fear had nearly overwhelmed their commitment to each other. The archive included not just their letters, but testimonies from others who had made similar choices during the war. Resistance fighters who had shown mercy to captured enemies, German soldiers who had refused orders that violated their conscience, civilians who had risked everything to help strangers from the opposing side. Klaus and Marie understood that their story was remarkable, not because it was unique, but because it represented possibilities that existed in every human heart. When Marie passed away peacefully in her sleep during the autumn of her 83rd year, Klaus spent his remaining months completing their joint memoir. He wrote with the same careful attention to detail that had characterized his wartime engineering work, ensuring that every memory was preserved accurately for those who would come after. Klaus followed Marie 3 months later, found by their gardener sitting peacefully beneath the apple tree where they had planted seeds from his family's Bavarian orchard. In his final letter, discovered on the kitchen table where they had shared so many conversations, he wrote simply that some love stories have no ending, only transformation into something larger than the two hearts that began them. Their house stands today as testament to what becomes possible when human beings choose connection over division, understanding over fear. The letters that once crossed enemy lines in secret now rest in archives where students study the miraculous persistence of love in conditions designed to destroy it completely.